To start off, we're going to ask Professor Dunn about the foundations of the civil rights movement. And looking back to the 1950s and the 1960s, if you could describe to us, compared to other cities, where was Cleveland in the spectrum of race relations? Was it more or less equal than other cities?
Thank you, Andrew. And first, I'd like to thank Andrew for putting on this very important discussion. And to my fellow panelists, it's an honor to be here with you. Cleveland was considered a more progressive, racially tolerant city during the 50s and 60s than many other major cities, particularly cities such as Chicago. Racial segregation was starting to solidify in the 30s, but it was still perceived as being more liberal and tolerant than other major cities in the North.
And so what happened then? I mean, did that trajectory continue? Was
No.
everything golden at any certain point?
I would say no. Obviously, it hadn't continued. I think with the as the black population reached a critical mass, those barriers of segregation hardened. As it's one thing when blacks and during slavery, Cleveland was considered. It was a stop on the Underground Railroad. It was actually called Hope for slaves transiting to the north, trying to get to Canada. So from that sense, Cleveland was very active in the abolitionist movement. And it's one thing when blacks are an abstraction, when they're in the South and you philosophically oppose the idea of enslaving other humans. It's another thing once they're a reality and living in your community and next door or vying for jobs, things of that nature. So I think as the black population increased, then the racial segregation discrimination lines hardened in the city.
And so then, Ms. Hall, as in your position as a curator of the Western Reserve Historical Society, what then happened? I mean, what was with the Great Migration coming north, what ended up happening in the city when people were suddenly faced with having black neighbors?
Well, people lived together, actually. You know, we didn't have as much polarity as you think. In Central neighborhood, there were blacks and whites living together. In Glenville, there were blacks and whites living together. There were blacks living amongst whites in Erie before they even started the outer migrations. So there are neighborhoods that are mixed. If you look at like Congressman Louis Stokes' class at Central, they're not all black, they're not all white. So we assume maybe a street, a couple of blocks, are maybe all black and all white, not living side by side necessarily. So everybody, white flight as we saw it in the 60s is not as hard-lined as you see earlier in some neighborhoods. And people were moving outward because most of the other suburbs are relatively new. So you could live in one half of one neighborhood and another half of another and work in similar capacities, but not in the same jobs, like at LTV. Someone was a boss and someone was down in the mines. So it came in stages. It came in pieces and parts. Even Mount Pleasant, there was an early settlement of African-American farmers who were given land because the farmer couldn't pay them. So we don't even have that typical migration pattern in Mount Pleasant. But it did follow those lines. So there are times, like now, there's overlap.
And when you say that it came in fits and starts and there were certain things, were there any factors that created these fits and starts? Were there any things that were happening in society where we could look back and say this was an instance where, or this was a point in time where things became more or less segregated? Were there any particular flashpoints, or was it so gradual with something like people moving to the suburbs that there wasn't anything that we would have noticed?
Well, during the 60s, people had more opportunity. They were making more money. Education was more available for many, from who were children of the, say, 40s and the 50s, who had degrees, who were educated, and those who could moved. Not just white people, black people did, for better opportunity. The move east, move west young man syndrome kind of happened a lot. So you have people moving into Shaker because they could on the east side. People moving into Lakewood because they could. People moving into even Beechwood, which was really new terrain. That is a relatively new suburb compared to the city of Cleveland. Shaker is an older one, but that development of African Americans moving and migrating into Shaker Heights didn't happen until the 60s.
And so what were some of those, I want to say, social centers then for the black community back then? Were there any churches that were extremely prominent? Were there any organizations that were rising that were coming up to further African American rights or issues?
They were the same that were happening across the country. You had the NAACP, SCLC, the Urban League. These are not new organizations, and they're not just germane to Cleveland. So people brought them with them from the South. They continued them in the North. The NAACP was started in 1909, so that's not a new phenomena to the 60s, if you will.
Okay. And
if I can jump in on that, in addition to our historic civil rights organizations, SCLC, NAACP, the Urban League, with this came on, and with it became economic. It became an issue of class. What Susan is talking about, those that could move did, those that couldn't remained. So now you interject multiple isms. So you still have some racism, you still have classism that's going on, and at the same time as the civil rights movement, you began to have feminism that rose up simultaneously. So you had all of those factors coming into play, and you had a sense of the economics of it all just interjected in. And so once we had more and more increasingly African American men and women in positions of authority, whether appointed or elected, and more were appointed and hired as a result of those elections, as a result of the Voters' Rights Act, then you had organizations that rose up to insulate and to create affinity for those African Americans. You had blacks in government. You had the National Association of Black Engineers. You had the National Forum for Black Public Administrators. You had the National Association of Black Accountants, the National Association of Scientists and Engineers. And so those entities in and of themselves that were set up and created to be safe havens for growth and development for those that were in those positions, because there was racism in the workplace. And so the conversation began to be, how do I be successful? I'm credentialed, I'm there, I'm alone, how do I do it? And so they began to be a cushion for one another. But in being a cushion for one another, there becomes some isolation. So you begin to have the uprising, and slow to be visible, but certainly visible now, just the classism that begins to occur. And those things happen, and we're all in the same church. And so you're dealing with racism, classism, sexism. Those became very real phenomenals that we still deal with very much today.
And let me speak to a precursor to those organizations in Cleveland was the Future Outlook League. And it was started by John O'Holly. And it was incorporated, articles of incorporation are at Western Reserve. And they started this and it was not a civil rights organization, it was an economic rights organization. And they led protests and campaigns on how to integrate the workforce. And they started a campaign that was all throughout the country and other areas as well, Adam Clayton Powell and some others, don't buy where you can't work. And it suggested that why would you continue to go to the Central Market, which they would go and picket at, the Central Bank and Trust, which became ultimately, I believe, Key Bank, and picket shirts and ties and placards in the 40s, in the 50s, to say, well, if we can't get a job here, why should we shop here? And eventually that broke down some of the economic barriers that did exist.
I was going to say, what exactly did they accomplish then?
Some of the first workers, Arthur Woods was one of them, who integrated first telephone operators at Ohio Bell from those campaigns. And one alleged tactic was to have everyone pay their bills in pennies, which created work slowdowns on the other side. And the main branch of the post office is named after John O'Holly today.
So when they were doing this, they weren't breaking the law necessarily. They were just, it was, and those were the tactics that they were using. What else were they facing though? As racism and sexism arise in the workforce, this was happening because people were limited in how far they could go in their work. Were there any other things that they were facing at that time that we might not think about today?
Well, if I might, there was also housing discrimination. Many of the covenants in the city of Cleveland had racial covenants on them, prohibiting a homeowner from selling their property to an African American, to a Jew. You can see that language still on those covenants, on some of those covenants. So as those lines of demarcation solidified, you actually had intimidation also to keep blacks confined to the central area. There's a classic book, The Ghetto Takes Shape by Ken Kersmer, that talks about the solidification and growth of the first black ghetto in Cleveland, which was the central neighborhood. And as you know, roughly, I think, maybe 70 or 80% of the public housing now is located in the central area or in close proximity to the central area. So that was another challenge that blacks did face.
And the organizations, I think you mentioned, Ms. Hall, that earlier that they started with economic things and then moved more into politics. When they were doing that, was there any fight back in these organizations to say, look, we're not really supposed to be addressing these issues of race. This is an economic organization. We want to further the role of engineers. We want to further the role of people that were in civil government. We don't really care about things like what's going on in Selma or Birmingham. Or did they have affinity for what was happening in other places?
One thing we have to keep in mind, the majority, you mentioned Selma and Birmingham, the majority of the African American population in Cleveland actually migrated from Alabama. So they have roots in Alabama. And I'm currently working on a book looking at the urban school desegregation process in the urban north. And I'm writing about that migration period. And Susan mentioned John O'Holly. Well, he was from Alabama, and he was a lower class black. So there were some class divisions there as well between the various organizations once they got here in Cleveland. The NAACP, they didn't necessarily approve of the tactics of John O'Holly with the Future Outlook League. They looked down on him, so that classism was a factor as well.
And so how much coordination then was there between these groups? Were they focused on their own issues, or did they eventually get brought into larger organizations? Did they form these?
Well,
I think it's a combination of different people took some of those pieces and parts into other organizations. Civil rights, since we just keep calling it that, encompass social rights, economic rights. We'll talk about a little later, justice system rights. I mean, it's often all-encompassing. Now, the Future Outlook League's mission was really about economic rights, which then led into the Black Economic Union, which started as the Negro Industrial Economic Union that was started in Kansas City, but here it was very large and run by Jim Brown. Carl Stokes was their general counsel, and as many may have seen, the famous image of that group at WGAR as they supported Muhammad Ali as he was going up against the draft. That was about economic rights, but it was about, can you live and work and play like everybody else? And how can you run your business? So that was, say, the next one. And there was also the Cleveland Business League. So even though they're divergent groups, they're not just so, they walk in a lockstep on just one issue.
Okay, so one of the questions that we also had too was, besides these economic, were there student groups, were there women groups that moved over into these areas? I mean, did they have enough? Did they rise up with like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee? Did they rise up here as well?
Well, their women's groups started simultaneously. You had, there are also, we didn't cover this before, but there are Mason groups, and the women's charters of those, the Eastern Star, that women's club groups, the Negro Business Professional Women's Club, who were doing all of those same types of things, maybe not on a bigger scale, say as the NAACP, because everybody was a member of the NAACP for the most part. So you were a member of the NAACP and you were also working with the Future Outlook League or with the Masons or with your sorority and things of that nature. So there's a lot of overlap. It's not just one or the other. They may not have always agreed on tactics or who's, you know, which area to go after first, but there was a lot more cohesion than you think, even amongst SNCC and SCLC. You know, they started together and then wanted to move ahead with different strategies with the same outcome.
Because it was all about equal opportunity. The bottom line is the common denominator between all of the organizations is how do you move a people forward? How do you get to equal opportunity? And it is not an accident that after 65, right, the Voters' Right Act, that in 68 we had the Fair Housing Act, right? Because that's when the choice for segregation really began, and that's when those that could move in the African American culture, because they were now appointed, elected, or had good government jobs, civil service protected, and they had more money, and so those things began to happen. And in the book, the Warmth of Other Suns, you have countless examples, and the one that quickly comes to mind is when a family moved into a upper class community in Chicago, and literally they called the police on them that same day, the same day as the moving trucks were leaving, the police were there, and then one by one, in a very short period of time, that street that they had integrated, that community, that neighborhood, that section of Chicago that they had integrated was now completely African American. And so that type of segregation and dealing with the psychosis of that, because these are families and they have children, and how does that impact the psychosis of those children? And when you raised the question a little while ago, the connection to our southern cities, to our roots, that was absolutely there. A reason why many of those families couldn't move forward as quickly as they wanted to economically, because there was a sole responsibility to send a significant amount of earnings back to your families in the South. We see that now. I have friends, my college roommate, her mother's Jamaican. A significant amount of her earnings that she made while we were in college, she sent back. And so I mean, that's happening even now for friends of mine that are here from other countries, but that is exactly what we had to do, because the chord was, how do we get to equality? How do you get to equity? And the reason why the emphasis was on the right to vote is because we knew that once we had the single right to vote, that you could then begin to make choices and decisions on those that represent you. And if you didn't like what they were doing, then you can make that change. But when you can't vote on the judges, then you don't have any control over the outcome of the criminal justice system. If you can't vote on the elected officials, then you don't have any voice in city planning. And so you begin to see the uprise of these urban ghettos, right? Because people are left behind. And so you have all of these issues, and so you have organizations like the Future Outlook League that's looking specifically at economics, but you still need the churches and the advocacy groups doing what they do, and you still need to push for elected leadership. You still need to push for education. And if you look at any urban city now, I mean, education is still left behind. It's one of those things: fair housing, education, employment, equal opportunity. We are still fighting for equal opportunity. And to the underlying question, are these organizations, do they still have relevance? They absolutely have relevance. Do they need to change their tactics, their strategy, and recenter? Absolutely they do, because as my African American professor of history said when I was in undergraduate college, Dr. Tiffany Patterson, it's so velvetized that it may take years because it feels so good that we don't even realize that we're left behind. And so you get a situation like Ferguson in the 50 years following so many great things that happen, and we wake up and say, we've been velvetized. All lives do matter.
And before we get to that point, I want to go back to something, a couple things you mentioned, specifically about the government, because in Cleveland in particular, one of the things that a lot of people might not necessarily realize was that starting in the 1960s, I believe it was 1968, blacks formed the most powerful voting bloc in places like city council, and we had our first African-American mayor back then. What effect did that have as soon as people started getting elected in a city like Cleveland, one of the largest cities in the country? And that Professor Dunn looks like he has an answer to that. But
yes, I wanted to speak to that history because a byproduct of that segregation was the development and growth of that black voting bloc that allowed Cleveland to elect an African-American mayor in '67 with Carl Stokes, when the black population was 37% of the city's population. Now that once again speaks to the progressive nature not only of the African American community but the city overall at that time. Now mind you, it wasn't just due to the altruism of people that they elected Stokes mayor. He writes in his biography that there in '66 we had the Huff riots. And as a result, the business community, the white business community, saw Stokes as an insurance policy against future racial unrest. So they supported his candidacy, his campaign, and a broad, diverse coalition obviously got him, ultimately resulted in his election. Well, in '68, we had the Glenville riot or shootout, if you will. So now, also another organization we failed to mention, the 21st Congressional District Caucus, which was established by the Stokes brothers. As we know, his brother Lewis went on to Congress, as well as George Forbes, Arnold Pinckney, the black leadership, if you will. They formed the 21st Congressional Black Caucus with the intent of institutionalizing black political power. So for a period there, this organization operated as a third political party, vetting candidates from both parties, the Democrat and Republican Party, for various elected positions. Now, ultimately, after Stokes didn't run for re-election in '72, his successor, Arnold Pinckney, didn't succeed. He lost to Perk at the time. And then from there, there was supposedly some infighting, and ultimately the black voting bloc was returned to the Democratic Party. A deal was made that resulted in the bulk of the black voting bloc returning to the Democratic Party.
And it's interesting, you mentioned organizations like the caucus to institutionalize black political power in the city. Mm-hmm. Was it these backroom deals that sunk it? I mean, what happened to the caucus like that? Because it sounds like if there are these changes happening in the 1960s and 70s with the rise of power in Cleveland, that would be something that would be fairly easy to institutionalize.
Yes, yes. The exact specific history and details I'm not fully aware of. I've learned or read that there was some infighting for leadership among some of the leaders within the caucus after Stokes did not run for re-election.
I can speak a little to that.
Fantastic, yes, please.
The 21st Congressional District also was changed. The lines were changed, like they were just recently changed for Cleveland wards. We went from, 19 to 17. So it went from the 21st to the 11th Congressional District as well. And it's still a thriving district, and people are still being vetted for seats along the way. And as we talked about organizations, let's talk about an institution. During the 21st District Caucus's reign, many deals, and meetings were happening in churches, in homes, and at the Lancer. People were meeting there. Politicians were meeting there. Everybody from the loan shark to the city councilmen were meeting there for meetings. There was a back room, upstairs room.
You're talking about the steakhouse and hotel that used to be on
Carnegie. Yeah. To meet. So you would have average Joes coming from work in their uniforms, sitting next to politicians. And one of the most powerful politicians at the time of the formation of the 21st District was also Charlie Carr. And Charlie Carr was a councilman. So there were black elected officials in Cleveland for many, many, many years. And so even without the big voting bloc that we may see now based on population, those changes started to occur. So remember that Louis Stokes had 15 consecutive years, the only black male congressman from the state of Ohio. 2 black females came thereafter, Stephanie Tubbs Jones, and then Marcia Fudge, who is our current congresswoman. So the bloc is still there. People are still politicking. People are still vetting candidates. And it's not just black candidates. I work on the parade and festival that they started, and it's now in its 44th year down Kinsman. And it started as a picnic to thank and give back, but also allow politicians, black and white, in the party to have a voice in the community, to talk to the community. And it still happens today.
But to the point of the real power behind the former 21st Congressional Caucus, it was in '89 in the race between White and Forbes, and immediately following that race, the magnitude of the gravity of the 21st Congressional Caucus began to decrease. And it decreased, and then lines are redrawn. And so the loss of steam, the loss of power, Miss Anna, who was basically...
Anna Chapman,
who was the principal architect of record, she began to age. She became ill, and she died about 10 years ago. And so when you lose that type of institutional knowledge, the weight and the gravity of it all, something's lost. And so while we do have the 11th Congressional Caucus, the astuteness, the gravity of the invitation to come before and say you want to be a candidate is not at the place that it was even 20 years ago. It was, 25 years ago. I came home from college in 1989, jumped on that campaign, and became very active, was highly engaged as a student that had just earned her degree in political science, was in the thick of it at the 21st Congressional Caucus, and literally it seemed like within 5 years, by 1994, it was just like, what happened? Poof, the magic dragon was gone, as it had been in 88, 89 for me, and it had been that way for 40 years, from the time the Stokes brothers and Mr. Pinckney and Mr. Carr and all of those heroes and sheroes of the African American culture here in Cleveland, what they created.
And so one of the things that was really interesting is you said that the institutional knowledge wasn't passed on to a younger generation. Was that by design? Was that just an accident of history that they never actually paid attention? They didn't think of bringing in more people to say, look, you're going to have to take over this mantle at some point.
I think it was an accident.
I won't say it's diminished. I mean, the young woman who is the chair of the Parade and Festival, for example, she's 50 years old. And she started as a young lady, a young girl, going to rallies with her parents and protesting there was no black-owned franchises for McDonald's. So she has kept it going, through the last 2 administrations, during Stephanie Tubbs Jones' administration and now into Marsha Fudge's administration. So sometimes there's a lack of transference of power. Institutional memory, it's hard. We have had other issues. Jesse Jackson ran for president. We have black mayors, black council people in suburban areas. So we didn't have to be so monolithic and tight on our focus anymore. And even today, the caucus the 11th district goes all the way into Akron. That changes the focus, it changes the politics, it changes the constituents. And that's only within the since Marsha Fudge became actually Congresswoman, so the last 6 years? So even who lives where, what are people's needs and interests have changed just based on what may appear to be some very arbitrary lines based on population shifts from the census.
And moving it to a larger focus and back to organizations, a couple of years ago, I'm sad he's not here to respond to this, but Reverend Smith, Hilton Smith, did say, when he was taking over the NAACP, he gave an interview to the Plain Dealer and said, we admit and we recognize that our organization has a massive problem in things like relevance, that people don't look to us anymore as a core organizing factor in the community. We can see then that politically there were certain things that precipitated the fall in power, maybe not the complete decline, but that people ended up losing some of that power. Other organizations, though, things like the Nation of Islam or the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, what happened to those organizations when they were in Cleveland and then declined in popularity?
Well, I think a lot of shift, particularly like the Nation of Islam, people started also, especially after Malcolm X in '64, was no longer affiliated with the Nation of Islam. African Americans who were of that faith then also shifted to become Sunni and Shiites and others, and that diminished the numbers. In some cities, I've actually had a meeting at their office in Chicago for a media product, but it's still thriving there. In Cleveland, it's slowly diminished, but just as there is Mosque number 7 in Cleveland. In Kinsman area, there's also the first black mosque that just celebrated a couple years ago its 75th anniversary. So I think people also started to, just like major churches moved or dwindled or shrink. And as we saw advances in integration, if you will, and rights, the fight and the mantle became different, and age being a factor. Elijah Muhammad was, you know, the absolute ruler, if you will. And upon his death, and then Malcolm's departure, and then subsequent assassination, changed how people saw that. Then a young Minister Farrakhan came up, but also at a time when the world was changing around us as well.
How is the world changing? I mean, what did you see? You did mention that integration in housing and stuff like that. Was that it, or were there other changes outside of race that started affecting the movements?
Well, one, the civil rights legislation of the 60s, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, and as Natoya had mentioned, the Voting Rights Act. So we now have blacks in position of political power, and the doors of opportunity are opening up. So those that were in a position to move out and up, or up and out, did so. So we don't have blacks being equally oppressed anymore. And we've actually seen fragmentation occurring within the black community. Eugene Robinson, the columnist for the Washington Post, wrote a book entitled Disintegration that talks about the fragmentation that's happening within black America. So we aren't this monolithic group, not that we ever were, but during the Jim Crow era, we were all, you had everyone. You had doctors, lawyers, garbage men, school teachers, everybody living in the same community.
Unilaterally oppressed.
Right, absolutely, equally oppressed. And you know, as you know, Andrew, my area of research, one of my areas is racial profiling. I argue that's the last vestige of racial oppression that treats all blacks equally, regardless of your social status, is racial profiling. But those are some of the things that I argue began to happen. Our interests weren't the same, based on our class status and those other social variables that differentiate.
You wanted to jump in.
I was just going to say, and then the other thing that happened is, as that was happening and the Great Migration was also continuing to occur, you have a people that are now also in culture shock. And we can't forget that, and we can't minimize the way of life in the South from that level of oppression directly. And then you get to urban neighborhoods where these people lived on the land. My ancestors, they lived on the land, and now you have people jammed into apartments, trying to make it at factories, not well educated, trying to make it and trying not to find themselves in a complete cycle of debt so that they could not move forward. At the same time, we had those that were lucky enough to become elected officials, appointed official, civil servants, and then you have, you know, Mr. Pete, who's still in this cycle of debt. And when they get to these urban areas, and then you see crime, and then you begin to see the impact of alcoholism, drug abuse, running the numbers, other systems to try to make it, all again in the effort of equal opportunity, but those things are now right outside your door, right outside your brownstone. You don't have a field to run across now. And so the economy, your quality of life is changing. And then you have cousins, brothers and sisters, nieces coming up to the north saying, you gave up the South for this, and you don't want to go back because you don't want to feel like a failure. But inside, you're feeling like you're ready to explode because it's either direct oppression in the South with the different bathrooms, water fountains, doors that you could go in, or indirect oppression, the way you live, you can work here, but you're going to make a quarter, and I'm going to make 75 cents, and we're doing the same job. And so all of those dynamics are going on, and that's why several organizations had to uprise, as leadership always does, some with emphasis on education, some with emphasis on economics, some with emphasis on the social quality of life, because all those dynamics are going on simultaneously as you're trying to raise a family.
And so what were the successes then of those organizations? Just to bring it forward through history, where did they find overwhelming or I don't want to say irredeemable, but total success? And then what happened to the other organizations, or what happened to those organizations that were successful? Did that happen at all? I mean, and if it didn't, then...
Well, I don't know if you can measure it by success. Yes, there were some successes along the way, some victories. I wouldn't call it success, but progress. We're always making progress. One, in the political arena, when you look at the number of black elected officials and public officials across the nation, and I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that started here in Cleveland. Right. When former Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones passed away, at her memorial service in public auditorium, then candidate Obama, Senator Obama, thanked Congressman Stokes and his brother for what started here in Cleveland. Absolutely. Referring to black political power. That's the result of him sitting in the White House today. So, and during that time, blacks in other cities were looking at Cleveland and the black community in Cleveland as the model. I recall going to a conference in Chicago, and this was the first time I had ever heard of the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. This was in 1998, and the name of the conference was the Black Radical Congress. And on a panel, there was Cornel West, Eric Michael Dyson, and Reverend Jeremiah Wright. And you talk about powerful. But that conference was pretty much similar to what you envision having here, an intergenerational dialogue between black radicals, as they called it, and the new generation that were to carry on the struggle. And I'll never forget the reception that myself, there were about 6 of us from Cleveland that attended, and the reaction we got when we told people we were from Cleveland, they looked at us like, oh my God, you all really have it going on. And we're looking at each other like, what are they talking about? But they were thinking of Cleveland back in the 60s and 70s when it was really progressive.
And now so I'm going to glam onto that. When you say, what are you talking about? Looking at Cleveland now, what do you mean by that? If you're looking around at Cleveland and saying, no, this is not at all where we want it to be,
well,
or was it?
I look at a lot of the statistical data when you consider the status of the city. It's almost become an annual thing of watching to see where we are on the poverty scale. How we rate nationally. When you look at the conditions, particularly on the east side of the city and in the county, and the African American community in particular, I'm referring to, I argue we've gone from being, if not then definitely one of the most progressive communities in the country to one of the most regressive. When you look at the socioeconomic conditions that exist in the African American community in particular, it leaves a lot to be desired. You wonder, why is this? How did this happen? When we've had political power and access to the halls of power for the longest, but yet when you look at the conditions in these neighborhoods, it really makes you wonder what really happened.
Is that a shared sentiment then about, with you, Ms. Hall, and with Ms. Buckner?
I would say so. If you look at, again, the statistics of the graduation rate in Cleveland Metropolitan Schools, as well as in surrounding communities of African Americans and non-African American students, the racial disparity of achievement gaps in Shaker Heights is astounding. What has happened? Why do we, And we thought, I think, you know, going forward through the 60s, that as things improved, everybody would improve along with those improvements, but that has not been the case. There are a lot of people who have been left behind for a lot of reasons. But we also have decades and centuries of undereducation, under skill set individuals who then got blocked out of jobs by a new class of individuals moving into the city. And as earning potentials for, say, white-collar employees increased, and some of us have had the benefit of that, working-class individuals stayed stuck. I mean, we argue now about the prevailing minimum wage. That's poverty level at $10 an hour. I mean, so that's not a black or white thing. That's anybody who's stuck making $10 an hour is stuck. And we are in an old industrial town with old housing stock. Those first, and I use this as a great example, those first housing projects at Outhwaite, where Congressman Stokes and his brother lived as children, was an improvement over the house they lived in on East 68th Street. Well, guess what? A lot of those houses are still over there. Well, guess what? The house he lived in on Case Court, that building is still there, and somebody lives there now, today. Wow, that's amazing. He'll be 90 years old on the 23rd, and the same edifice still exists with a family living inside. So what has changed, black or white? So we see a lot of progress. We have more more people with educations, fancy cars, big houses. You can live in Aurora, you can live in Twinsburg, and black people can live in Shaker. But you can still get stuck in a house that is 60, 70 years old. And you don't own it. And the housing crises and the mortgage crises. So how do we get out? So it's not just a black and white moment. It's not just a race-based thing, but race has also regressed a lot of things. Like, well, not only are you black, but you're black and you're poor and you're uneducated. You need not come. You need not apply. And those who have class is a big issue in every community in America. The velvet rope syndrome, as I call it, growing up in New York, where we go to clubs and you can't get on the other side of that. It's not a big phenomenon here, but that's big there, still is. No. You're from Brooklyn, Queens, and not Manhattan. You can't get in. But now Brooklyn's the bomb. Everybody wants to be there. And it's outdistanced and outpaced. So things are cyclical and they change. So where does gentrification get us? Where do people go? But people are still stuck in places today that they were stuck in the 60s, that they were stuck in the 30s because of race and lack of opportunities. And some didn't take advantage of them, some would say. Well, you didn't go to school and you're a truant today. Well, there were truants all the time, but if you are bred to believe that you are inferior and you can't get ahead and your book is old and outdated, my kids had tablets at their school. Some public schools here do, some schools don't. So we got a lot of issues, and I think that they're real, and race is a big part of it. I mean, I work in an institution. I will call them out tonight. I call them out when I'm there. There's 60-plus folks there. I'm the only African-American on professional staff. What does that say about University Circle Institution that deals with history? That's powerful to me. So.
Okay. And would you agree? The next question I have, really, and if you wouldn't mind kicking it off,
Sure.
Has anything really changed? I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of pessimism. So first, has anything really changed? And what do you see as the issues that really need to be addressed today?
The great poet Robert Frost said, and many miles to go, and many miles to go. And I think that we have many miles to go, and we've come from many miles long ago. But I do think that in all of our efforts, all of our advocacy efforts, when we were working together, when we were unilaterally, systematically oppressed, fighting for integration, the ripple effect and the downside of integration is the lack of complete self-sufficiency and segregation, and then that leads itself to classism. And so I think that all of those things are very real. They're very real in my family. They're very real in their families. We can see it when I go south. And so those types of things, that is very real. Absolutely, we made a tremendous amount of progress, on the backs, on the deaths of the blood, sweat, and tears of countless names of men and women and children that we'll never know. And we all can count the 5, 10 that are talked about every time it's Black History Month. But there are countless, there are thousands that gave their life, their sweat equity, their blood, sweat, and tears for us to be where we are. For somebody like me to receive the fellowships that I received. And I pay homage to those people. And so absolutely, there's been a lot of progress. But we have to transfer that sense of responsibility to our young people. And so to my son and to my nieces, because they have so much more than we had at their ages, and it's so much more than my mom and my grandparents had that I have. And so we have to make sure that they know we cannot discount this thing. Mm-hmm. This is not just 28 days of the year for me. For me, it's every single day, every single teachable moment for every child, every person that's in my space when something happens, to talk about it. And so absolutely, we made tremendous progress. But in the words of Robert Frost, and many miles to go and many miles to go. And we have to do it, and we have to do it with everyone, because this entire struggle has never been 100% Black. It's always included Caucasian, Jewish, Italian, and other. This has been a fight that we all have been a part of, and that is why the women's rights, it's not an accident that women's rights and sexism rose up immediately following civil rights, and now, gay rights and all those things, because the bottom line is, for every person in America, and I was even back in to say in the world, when I had the opportunity to travel to Europe for 30 days, everybody wants an equal opportunity. And every time you make a step forward, you have to have your hand back, because there are things that were left behind. Desegregation, classism, what happens when I can move and I leave little Johnny, and you create these systems and these cycles so that they aren't stuck behind. And we can't be selfish as we move forward, and that is why we have to transfer this knowledge and share this information and celebrate it every single day, because the reality is there is no one solution. There's no one solution. We're always going to continue to be fighting for equity in education, economy, workplace, health statistics. I mean, we didn't even talk about health statistics, but when you talk about the overwhelming impact of health, and when you talk about a study that was completed 2 years ago, the 7 miles between Huff and Lyndhurst, and the 18 years of life expectancy within 7 miles, those are things that we really have to talk about. And so you have to continue to advocate for, and we have to continue to use the churches. We have to continue to use every single nonprofit and every organization to push for and advance each of these things. Because if we move ahead economically, but now I'm 42 and I've had amputations because I didn't know how to take care of my diabetes, or low birth weight babies, or infant mortality, or cancer, or HIV/AIDS, or cardiac disease that are disproportionately impacting communities of color. The same 5 since David Satcher in the Clinton administration came out with a report on health disparities. And those health disparities, when you push behind the surface, goes back to equal opportunity in employment, right? And equal opportunity in education. And so those things.
So those are the things that you would focus on if
Those
we're going
are-
to have to move on just for the Q&A, but
Yeah, but those are things that, all our ancestors were fighting for even back then. So we've made progress, and I'll say again, in the words of Robert Frost, and many miles to go, and many miles to go, because those continue to be the points of equity for any community.
okay. Thank you, Professor.
I would add to that the criminal justice system. We have accepted the disparities in the criminal justice system as a condition rather than being a problem. I mean, there are glaring racial and ethnic disparities in that system, and I think we are at a moment in history where we're compelled to begin to address that because of the current issues happening not only locally but nationally in relation to communities of color, particularly the African American community and the police. And I'm cautiously optimistic that we've reached a tipping point, that we will never go back to the way things were in 2014. And I'm so heartened by the younger generation, that same intent on not accepting it and tolerating it, and are actually getting out here and are advocating and putting their bodies and lives out there on the line to bring about change in that regard. So I argue that the criminal justice system is the one area in public life where people of color, particularly blacks, have an uncontested racial preference or affirmative action, if you will. But we as a society, we are comfortable with those disparities. We look at it and we accept it like that's the natural order of things. That's the way things are supposed to be. So I would argue that is the struggle, the battle that is yet to be waged, but we are finally beginning that battle.
Okay. And finally rounding out.
Well, I concur and agree with that as well. I'd say that as a historian, for me it's important, especially for young people, to understand where we've been so that as they go forward, they are mindful of what has happened, the strategies that worked, those that did not. And I have young adults who, I've been beating on them so long, they don't have a choice, and they started to see it. I have a 19-year-old who did her first protest at University of Cincinnati and did a die-in. But she understood that that was not just new and germane to her and her peers, that has happened before them and before, her grandparents, and revolt, resistance is not new, and it's not just germane to African Americans to seek redress, remedies of inequalities and iniquities that exist around the country and around the world. So I think it's important that I wish he was here with us tonight so we could have heard from him, and to say, start from where you are, but go back and understand, and everything is not what it seems. Rosa Parks didn't just decide one night, my feet hurt and I'm not gonna get up. I mean, there's a bigger story to that. They went to the Highlander School. They studied and practiced and strategized what should happen, when, where, and made very conscious decisions. But so did the Black Panthers, so did SCLC, so did SNCC. They weren't just reactionary organizations, so did Marcus Garvey. I mean, and the NAACP in its early years until now, nothing just happens in a reactionary stance. And we can very easily be accused of starting riots, and mayhem and dismay, when in all actuality that may be an outgrowth of an incident, but that was not the tactic nor the strategy. And I implore younger people to understand not just what's happened in America, but in other societies and other countries at different periods in time, what has worked, what has happened, and not to necessarily always be in a reactionary moment.
And so one thing that, with this die-in that your daughter participated in, are these organizations, like what role do organizations that traditionally had a role in civil rights movements, what role do they have nowadays? And this will be the last question before we open it up, because I do want to get some Q&A. But when we look at these things that are happening, like die-ins, like the protests that are happening in Public Square in the fall, what role do the organizations that have traditionally played a role, like churches or the NAACP, what are they doing?
I don't know the answer to that question, quite frankly. I know at her school that there's an racial awareness organization, and it's made of, and it's well entrenched at the university, that sponsored that, and other students got on the bandwagon, and maybe other residents in Cincinnati came on board as well. So how younger people are actually doing it beyond social media, and there are youth groups, and there always have been youth groups, say in the NAACP, the AXO group, they get scholarships, they go to conferences, they have their own conference in the summer where they meet, as well as go to national conference, and that's been going on all along. Congressional Black Caucus has youth leadership programs as well for college students. So they are there, and different churches will have them. I can't say that right now, say SCLC, Cleveland branch, young people are engaged and involved. Sometimes people in my generation are not as involved with them, even though I know all of them, if you will, and the powers that be. But I haven't been on the bus with them to go to DC when they went not too long ago, back in December. But then I found a different role for myself. So young people, depending on the city, are connected to well-entrenched ones like the NAACP and the Urban League, and then they have their own.
So I want to echo your statement. It's too bad James Hayes wasn't able to make it tonight, but we're going to open it up for the Q&A portion of this.
I wonder if you could put your black radical hat on. And in the context of this sort of post-racial society that we all, I think, are clear didn't really exist, what is the solution for Black Cleveland, Black Northeast Ohio, for that community to get a leg up, to improve its plight, if you will, its situation currently?
I think it's imperative that we continue to educate our young people, to bring them on board so that they understand the highly educated, the undereducated, if you will, of how important it is to take a stand. And I very much, I'd say the beneficiary of the movement, if you will. I did not march. I was a little girl. So I'm one of the first generations out the box, if you will. And I grew up on the East Coast as well. So it's a different kind of dynamic, say, than in the South. So I would say Operation Breadbasket was meaningful. It was powerful. You know, everybody misjudges and maligns the Black Panther movement today because of their stance on not going down without a fight. They didn't start fights necessarily. They were just willing to, you know, be armed. Armed resistance and armed self-defense is different than coming blazing with a gun. So things that organizations like that did, I would encourage and like to see come back, and that they happen from the grassroots in the communities as well as from, you know, the big organizations and institutions and trickle down. There's got to be some kind of meeting of the minds. Every church around town, especially Black churches, and inner city churches of all ethnicities have soup kitchens and clothes giveaways. Well, you know, it's got to extend beyond one day a week, but those are necessary moments. People, illiteracy is high in urban centers, and we need to volunteer. So the radicalism there is get involved. So when my daughter was protesting, I was happy to see that happen, and she took a stand. But she also volunteers. She also you know, in addition to her studies. She tutors at a high school. Those are the things that each one reach one. If we don't reach back, everybody's left, black, white, or otherwise. And it's real that, you know, we live in such a media bubble with the Kardashians and the Atlanta housewives and these athletes that are making millions of dollars. That is so inconceivable, but that's, you know, the chosen frozen, if you will. What about everybody else? You know, the rest of us who are out here tonight that go to our jobs every day, we all want nice things. So how do we get it? Sometimes you got to give it, and sometimes you got to help somebody else get a leg up, or get them some boots so they could pull those straps up, because maybe they don't have any.
You know, I'm a preacher's wife, and I certainly see that our community, when I look at our history and I'm looking at programs and reading the history and the weight of the pastor's words to his or her congregants is not the weight that it was yesterday. And I think that the churches and the nonprofits have to have a louder voice. There has to be conversations with the leaders, whether elected, appointed, or coming up on your own, because we have to have those that can go out there and risk advocacy. We know that our nonprofits can't do it because their 501c3s would be threatened, and legally they would be threatened. But we have to have a level of trust in and around our community, whether it's the grassroots leader from anthropology, you know, Ms. Hayes, who can command the entire neighborhood with her words because her word is her bond, or the pastors, and the pastors and the neighborhood groups have to continue to work, and they have to work with the media. The media frames things. The media is a very powerful voice, and it frames things. And if we aren't teaching and sharing, as Susan indicated, then our children will be misguided by the media and the social media. And I think that we have to continue to organize, and we have to continue to have our voice, but we have to continue to outline a level of relevance inside of our organizations that will attract young people, and not only attract them, build them up so that they have some value and voice, so that they aren't just out there and saying, why the heck should I come when I'm gonna be pushed to the side? And I think that our organizations nationally, because the challenges inside our local organizations, civil rights organizations, are the same across the country. For friends of mine that live across the country, we have to have succession planning, and we have to learn when it's time to let go, so that young people can stand up and have the history and the girth of the experience of the elder statesmen and women to make a decision. And if they fail, so be it, but there is progress even in failure to push them forward. As long as young people are held down, they're not gonna come inside those doors, and they're gonna be radical against those organizations, and then we'll have quote unquote infighting, and so it's hard to move forward with a common agenda.
Professor?
I wanna go back to a point I raised earlier. First of all, I think we're in a transformative moment where, with the issues presently confronting the city of Cleveland relative to our police department and the DOJ, there's a much larger opportunity here, not only to transform our police department and the relationship between the police and the community. I argue we can transform the greater Cleveland region and make this city, this region, an equitable city for all citizens. But we can also set a model, not only at the local level, but at the state and national level, I've been appointed to the governor's task force on police-community relations, and I was invited to write a letter to the president's task force on 21st century policing. So once again, I think we're in that transformative moment. I mentioned when actually the other week I had left a meeting, a community meeting dealing with the DOJ issues, and I was at home on a Saturday writing on the book I had mentioned earlier, writing the history of Congressman Stokes and his brother Carl when their parents had migrated to Georgia, from Georgia to Cleveland during that migration period. And I got to the point where I was writing about Carl Stokes' election as mayor, and it struck me when I was writing that piece I shared with you about him acknowledging that he was basically tapped to be an insurance policy against future racial unrest. Well, Cleveland, we dodged a bullet with these recent shootings and deaths, and that we didn't have the reaction that Ferguson did. And I think that's attributable to a number of things. One, we do have black leadership, which we have had at the highest level for 30, 40 years in the mayor's seat, but much further back going in council. But it struck me, we're in one of those moments again. There are conversations being had with the business community. They're paying attention. The progress that Cleveland has experienced recently, this renaissance, they don't want to lose that, okay? So once again, they're at the table, they're saying, hey, we have to address these issues. So it's that same moment, that same sense that the business community had in '66 when they tapped to Carl Stokes and said, look, you know, basically you're our insurance policy. We have that moment before us once again. So what I'm saying is there's a role for all of us here. It's not only to address the issues relative to the African American community, but all of Greater Cleveland, and make it an equitable city that all can enjoy and thrive. And once we get to those issues, I argue, I always address issues from the lens of the criminal justice system primarily, but I argue that's going to impact those other institutions, the schools, the family, because if a parent is mired in the criminal justice system, and we do have systems in place to keep them perpetually caught up in it, then what effect is that going to have not only on that individual, but their family, their children, and it becomes an intergenerational cycle. So once again, I'm saying all that to say, I think we're at one of those moments in history where we can really transform what our society looks like, but there's a role for all of us to play in that.
And I think I saw, was Lizard up there? Yes. Oh, would you kindly come up then? Yeah, absolutely.
So first off, I want to say that I don't believe in this time that there are a lot of youth that are necessarily misguided or necessarily uneducated. I worked with a group of young people. I'm 20, by the way. And there were a lot of 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds among the group that were in a basement for hours, 13 hours, 14 hours a day for like 3 weeks, doing research for hours and researching policies and researching models that they could put into place so that we could present those models to City Hall, you know, and go to legislation and confront them. So I want to make sure that, you know, these particular people get that recognition that they need because they are feeling disheartened and hopeless because they're not receiving acceptance from the elders in the community. You know what I mean? So my question to you is, how do you believe that we can bridge the gap between elders and the youth, between experience, tactics, and education-wise?
Well, Lizard, before they answer, could you give us like a particular instance where you felt like you weren't being taken seriously or you weren't?
I'll say I went to a GCC meeting.
Which is?
Greater Cleveland Congregations.
Yeah. And they were talking about the findings of the DOJ report, which I've read several times. and I was told that I couldn't, we were passing out flyers, but the flyers were in the same sort of understanding of the meeting. So they were like, you know, pretty much based off of what the meeting was about as well. But I was told toward the end that I was told not to do that, but I wasn't told not to do that. And they sort of gave me a feeling that I wasn't accepted there. I was the youngest person in the room at the time. And I felt as though I couldn't connect with them. You know what I'm saying? I couldn't make that connection between the elders and myself, or I couldn't make the connection between the elders who were a part of the, I don't know what you call that. It's like a group of church leaders. They came down to City Hall December 8th. And I couldn't make that connection between them and myself and you know, the other people who I were with, who were also a part of the, you know, the youth who's been out on the streets and on the ground and doing the research. We couldn't make that connection with each other, and I'm not sure how or how that can happen, or how can we fix this particular problem, because I would love to share experiences between myself and an elder and be able to come up with ways and tactics that we can use today to fix the problems that we have.
Well, I'm going to speak to that quick, that as you are a youngster to me, and I am then a youngster to them, they put me at the kiddie table sometimes. I got as much gray hair, nicely covered up right now, than a lot of them. And it is a systemic, definitely in Cleveland, I would say, more, maybe not in other cities. I can't say that because I spend most of my time here, but we do have a leadership that won't let go. And oftentimes, not all of them, and I say this to you because I have said this to them, we don't want you to go away because we learn from your strategies, your tactics, your successes, your failures as well. But we need you to move over and let me sit at the table too and not sit at the kiddie table. And one way is, as you formed your own organization, though, to have membership in the well-entrenched organizations as well, to create relationships, to have interactions, not so much to say, you know, to take over, but sometimes you come up the ranks, but you can't be at the table either if you're not there. If you're not a card-carrying member of the Urban League or the NAACP or some other organization, you're still on the outside. So having come through many of those organizations, sometimes more often than not, you know, duck in, duck out. But it's a challenge. I agree with you 100%, because there are times we have leaders that are, you know, my parents' age and older, and I'm like, you know, and they're admonishing me sometimes, you know. And I'm not a baby anymore, far from it. My kids are your age. You see what I'm saying? And so you have to keep pushing and figure out, on the one hand, when to push the envelope, and maybe it sounds disrespectful, but come forward. And I chide them now. You know, I'm real outspoken. I'm like, I need you to move over, not out. You know, but there is no, oftentimes, succession plan, and very top-heavy age-wise. But that's how we operate oftentimes. And if you're not careful within your own organizations, the same thing will happen. You know, I'm smarter, I'm older, I know more.
So we're actually, we're running out of time, but I absolutely wanted to get a couple more comments in from you, so feel free to.
I wanted to, one, I was looking, when you asked about new young activists, I was looking for Lizard, but I could barely see her because I know that her and her organization, the New Abolitionists Association, I met them at a meeting, a community meeting, and I had heard about them and the work that they were doing, and a reporter had driven up from Cincinnati to interview me from Al Jazeera about all of everything that's going on in the city, and I introduced him to Lizard and her colleagues, because I think what we have to do, as Susan stated, our elders, they don't want to, unfortunately, some of them won't relinquish the position or authority or move out of the way to give the younger generation opportunity. I don't want to be guilty of doing the same thing. So I look for opportunities to give young people the space and the opportunity to step into those leadership roles. So I think that's incumbent on us. I learned from others' mistakes or the opportunities I weren't afforded. I want to make sure that I don't commit those same mistakes.
Okay, and are you somebody that then you would be able, like younger people like Lizard could reach out to you and say, look, I really need to get through to Zach Reed. I really need to get through to Hilton Smith. Is there any way you could provide a...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. All right.
And I just wanted to echo what they said and to add and to share 2 examples. Dr. King, and everyone knows Dr. King because he's glamorized. That's who he is. And the media did that in large part, and deservedly so, but he didn't do anything in isolation. But I can tell you, as a young man, he too fought to get at the table, to be a decision-making table. And the reason why his voice at the March on Washington is the lone voice that we remember is because he was actually scheduled to speak earlier in the day. But the powers that be said, no way, I'm not going to let this young man, I've been fighting this fight for years and years and years. And he got pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. And he finally went to the mic at 5:58, and the 6 o'clock news covered it. And so he was the only one who was covered. That was an accident. That was not planned, okay? The second example is a Dr. King example as well. He pulled out of the Southern Baptist organization to create the SCLC. That was a radical move. And at that first meeting, it was so radical amongst pastors, people of faith, and one pastor died because there was a fight there. So I say all that to say to you that age and dealing with the younger generation up and coming and the older generation that are established, that's always been a challenge to find space at the table. But I encourage you to continue with your own organizations, but you have to have a card in order to have a place at the debate. Because if you aren't card carrying, you won't have a place in the debate because you're a non-issue. And that's just the way that this society works. So continue to do your own, but have your ears to the grindstone of what's going on elsewhere so that you can then begin to figure out where the commonalities are. And it's there at the silver lining of commonality that you can begin to work together, and it makes logical sense.
Fantastic. So we are out of time. We do want to thank our panelists again, Ronnie Dunn, Susan Hall, and Natoya Walker-Minor. Can we just give them another round of applause, please?
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We want to thank Mayhalls for providing the venue and you for showing up. Feel free to stick around and get a drink at the bar. And on behalf of Civic Commons Idea Stream, thank you and have a great night. Stay warm.